and you can all hear me okay. Brilliant. I'm Jamie McCall. I'm the chair of the Theatre 3 sessions today. I work for PLB. We're a museum design consultancy based in York. And I'm really pleased to say our next guests, our next speakers are also from York. So they're going to be doing modern accessibility in a medieval setting. So we have Dr. Ashley Fisher, Community Engagement Supervisor, and Philip Roebuck, Exhibitions Executive for the York Archaeological Attractions. And if you could just give them a warm welcome, please.
Thank you, everybody. So as Jamie very nicely pointed out, I'm Dr. Ashley Fisher. I'm a white woman in her late 30s wearing jeans and a black polo shirt with York Archaeology embroidered in red and white on it. I have short cropped purple hair and a wonderful purple walking stick with me. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Community Engagement Supervisor at York Archaeology.
Yes, and my name's Philip. I am the Exhibitions Executive at York Archaeology. I'm a white person with short ginger hair and a ginger beard, wearing a matching black York Archaeology shirt and some brown trousers, and my pronouns are he and they.
So our talk today is modern accessibility in a medieval setting. We are having a new exhibition coming up that incorporates the findings from my doctoral research. So I'll be talking about the research part of it.
And then I'll be talking about the actual site itself and how we've tried to implement some of those changes.
All right. So a bit of background. There we go. Excellent. My thesis was titled Out of Sight, Out of Mind, Accessibility for People with Hidden Disabilities in Museums and Heritage Sites. I had three case study sites in York and Leeds. Bonus points if you can recognize all three of them. Barley Hall was one of them, which is what we're talking about today. All of them are listed buildings, which means they all had the limitations that come along with that as well. But that was also the point, that the solutions for increasing accessibility aren't just let's rip everything out and make it new again. We had to work with what we had. And also, it's not using the listed building designation as an excuse. We can't put wheelchair ramps and lifts in here, so we shouldn't bother at all. No, that's not what we're doing here. It's okay, we can't put in wheelchair ramps and lifts here because of the physical limitations. So what can we do instead of that? And that's kind of what this research, how it was inspired. But the case study sites were only part of it. It was incredibly important for me to amplify the voices of disabled people. So I asked my participants to how these three sites could be more accessible for them. I had participants who had a range of disabilities and impairments, from physical conditions like arthritis, fibromyalgia, and hypermobility, to mental health conditions like anxiety and depression, to neurodiverse conditions like dyslexia, OCD, and Irlen syndrome. I went with each participant to a certain case study site. We went around on a normal visit, chatting the whole time, and we had a post-visit debrief talking about the barriers that they encountered when we went around. So I collated all that data, wrote 450 pages, and voila, a PhD. It's really that simple, guys. But what is Barley Hall? Philip is going to tell you.
So, lovely picture. Barley Hall is, the short answer is what we say, it's a restored medieval townhouse. But that doesn't really give you the whole picture, because Barley Hall has a bit of an interesting modern history as well. We are an archaeological trust first and foremost. And when in the late 1980s, some development work was happening on this street, Coffee Yard, it was discovered that within the tangle of buildings and workrooms and a plumber's shop, there were actually the original timbers of a large medieval townhouse dating from the 13th century. So York Archaeology, we swooped in, we did the excavations on the site, and the decision was made to try and restore the site, do a bit of experimental archaeology, rebuild a medieval townhouse right in the center of York. Now, what the intention of that was not only to see if the research sort of checks out, but this is shortly after the Jorvik Viking Centre is opened. There was a hope that this might become a sort of medieval Jorvik attraction where people could come in and experience living in the medieval time period. So a great deal of work was put into this, and in the early 90s. It originally opened as a visitor attraction, with a lot of support from communities and donations in order to try and dress the house and make it as realistic as possible, a site for living history. It didn't pan out that way, unfortunately. There were some issues with funding, particularly in the late 90s, which meant that a lot of those plans had to be put on hold. In the meantime, the site has then been developed to house a lot of temporary exhibitions, and over the years, they've sort of built up on top of each other until the site is sort of a mixture of lots of different things. But at its core, literally in its bones and its structure, it is a medieval building, timber frame building from the 13th century.
Mhm. So more background stuff. Before we get into the really good stuff, we have to think about how we frame disability. So back in the medieval times, they had a different view of disability than we do now. The medieval view of disability could and certainly is a completely different topic. So please understand that this is a very brief, very shallow overview of how they view disability. But basically, illness and disability were linked to sin, especially first sin. The first sin. So a lot of body differences were seen as the result of someone's sin, whether it was yours or your parents or that person who chopped your limb off with a sword or whatever. They also thought that suffering helped you in the afterlife. So the more you suffered here, the better off you were when you got to heaven. So they weren't really concerned with accessibility, and their buildings show it. But obviously, we aren't in medieval times anymore, thankfully. If you have been in the disability sphere for any amount of time, you will have heard about the medical and social models of disability. So we don't have a ton of time. I'm not going to explain those. If you want to know about them, talk to me afterwards. But the important thing to know is actually we didn't use either of those models. We used something called the human rights model, which is like the next level of the social model. So in the social model, it's not a person's impairments that disable them, it's society that disables them. With the human rights model, it's still society that impairs them, but there are still physical implications and side effects that need to be acknowledged in a disabled person's experience. So for example, I have chronic fatigue. That means my body is terrible at storing and using energy. Hence why I'm sat on a stool for this. I can't stand for more than about 10 minutes without absolutely dripping sweat. But the inclusion and accessibility of something as simple as this stool means that I am included and can participate as much as everybody else here, which is fantastic. But I'm still going to have to deal with the physical symptoms later on, like the stomach ache that is absolutely going to happen in about 2 hours, and the brain fog that's going to happen in 2 hours as well. So really, using the human rights model of disability, we are acknowledging that we're trying to take away as many barriers, but people are still going to experience those negative side effects just because that's how these impairments work.
So,
No, that way.
yeah. So, where does this come into Barley Hall? What are the limitations of a medieval site like this? I've gone back to this picture because at first it was like, oh, look at that lovely medieval building. And now look at the threshold before you get into the medieval building. Look at the very steep staircase that is required to get into the building. There are thresholds like that throughout the ground floor. There are uneven floors. There are narrow and there are tall staircases. Essentially, we came up to a problem here, which was the experimental archaeology was saying, how was this done? How can we do it? How can we replicate the medieval structure? And what that also meant was we have replicated the medieval model of disability, which is that basically a lot of people are not going to find it very comfortable to try and get around this building. Now, to add a little bit of spice to that, it's also listed. So once it was all constructed, it is a grade 2 listed building, which means that we can't really change much of that structure anymore. So we're faced with quite a lot of problems that, again, are in the bones of this building. But just because there are problems within it doesn't mean that the building is completely inaccessible. And it doesn't mean that we should give up on trying to make it accessible. So I think you have a point about that next.
I do, yes. So first things first, there is no such thing as being fully accessible. For the love of heritage, can we stop saying that our sites are fully accessible? Because they are not. It might be fully wheelchair accessible. And even if it is, I would encourage you to have someone who uses a manual wheelchair and someone with an electric wheelchair go around, because those had two very different needs before you say that you're fully wheelchair accessible. Step-free access is completely different. So really think about what you're actually saying when you say, how accessible you are. Yes, so no fully accessible, but that's okay. One of the things that came out of my research is actually that one person's access needs can completely interfere with someone else's access needs. For example, someone might need brighter lights so they can read this text board better, but those same bright lights might trigger migraines in this person. So the point is not to make our sites fully accessible. The goal is to provide the space and tools for people to experience the same thing equitably. And that's where we come to this concept of active and passive accessibility. So basically, active accessibility measures are the things that people have to ask for so that they can use it, whether it's braille guides that you keep behind the desk, or having the lights turned up or the sounds turned down during quiet hours, things like that. Whereas passive accessibility measures are built into the design of the exhibition from the very beginning. So simple things that a lot of people already do: size of text, color contrast, things like that.
Yes, indeed. So if we want to take some more immediate and practical examples from how we've applied this, a great place to start is probably chairs, because I think it's become fairly common now that in a lot of galleries you will have chairs that people can pick up, stools that they can access, that they can take themselves. Now, one of our sites is very popular with schools and has a lot of footfall, a lot of people moving through it. And so we did have chairs. We had folding chairs that people could use, but they were kept quite apart from the main thoroughfares. And the sort of idea behind it was, of course, if anyone needs a chair, they could just ask for a chair, couldn't they? But not everyone knows that they can ask for a chair. Not everyone wants to have to ask for a chair. So moving these things into the galleries, into places that are more obvious, where people feel empowered to make that decision themselves, is a really important part of this. If we're going into other cases, particularly, say, Barley Hall, where we're looking into more sensory aspects, that immersive aspect, we created sensory boxes. Particularly these ones were aimed at children and school groups again, because those are our main audiences, with things that they can use, things they can do. I'm sure some of you may have seen the other speakers earlier talking about sensory trails, things like that. But when these were first implemented, they were lovely boxes that were all kept behind the front desk. And yes, it says on the website, you can ask for a sensory box if you need one, but that's assuming that everyone's going to be checking the website, and then assuming that they're going to want to ask for it and not feel embarrassed or social pressure, or just not feel up to interacting in that way. So moving these things into a more passive accessibility model means that making them available to people without them having to engage in their own sort of effort of figuring things out or who they're going to talk to. It's taking as much impetus off the visitor as possible. So, do you want to talk to you? Lovely access hubs and a nice piggy. So, what is an access hub? So, access hubs, I'm sure this is not news to a lot of you, but it is really important. They've become increasingly common over the last couple of years. It's essentially moving those tools from a barrier, moving them from a place where they are behind a desk, where you have to talk to a person, moving them to a space where people are now in control and have the choice of what they want to use, what they want to take. An access hub can be a simple collection of very basic accessibility tools, a couple of which I've listed here, which people can pick and choose and use as they see fit. And as I'm sure I think a lot of you as well will have noticed with some of the fantastic talks that have been going on, there is now a movement towards digital tools as well, making digital accessibility a big part of how we engage with sites, particularly ones which have limits on physical accessibility. Things like tablets and QR codes are probably stuff we've already thought of. One that really, was quite important to me figuring out was headphones. How many sites say, oh yeah, we've got audio guides, you can listen to them, but not everyone wants to walk around with their phone on their ear. Some people don't want to do that. Some people can't keep their phone held up to their ear the whole time. And if you're like me, you will sometimes go to a museum and not think, I should have brought my AirPods from home. So having just simple wired headphones that people can borrow is a fantastic tool to help supplement that digital accessibility.
Excellent. But it's not as simple as turning active accessibility tools into passive accessibility tools. Both have a place in exhibition design, and especially with the conservation aspect. But one really interesting aspect of my research that came out was something we see in basically every museum. Text panels on the wall. I've called them communal reading because, as it turns out, almost all of my participants hate them. Absolutely hate them. They'll glance at a wall panel and move on. For some people, they can't use their tools like the colored overlay on there, which helps with dyslexia. Some people can't read them because they're poorly lit. Some people spend more time worrying that people are judging how fast or slowly they're reading than actually reading. And sometimes, especially in the post-COVID world, people just don't want to stand that close to someone that they don't know. So, what do you do instead of wall panels?
So we are looking here at what I call portable panels, which again is not a new idea, but it is very fun, very cost effective, and a very useful one. You might have noticed in that previous slide, those wall panels, those are all from old exhibitions at Barley Hall.
They're from Barley Hall, yes.
So we're not just taking random images. These are things that have been put on display in a medieval house, which has poor lighting and has odd-shaped walls and all sorts of issues like that. We're hoping that with portable panels, we can start to address that problem. So in the slide here, I've got two which are from the new exhibition that are going in. These are drafts done by our fantastic graphic designer, Katie Smith. You'll also see a mock-up of the boxes which are going to be used to store these. Now, these are quite important. The point of the portable panel is that you can move around with it, you can sit down with it, you can move to an area with more lighting, you move to an area with, where you feel more comfortable, away from other people if needed. And it's something that is small and light. These ones will be made in acrylic, so a nice light material. The odd little circles at the top there will be cut out, so you'll have a hole that is for lifting them out of the stands. You'll notice there were two stand designs there. We'll talk a little bit about sort of research and getting feedback a bit later on. We've chosen to go with the taller of the two because it requires less bending. Simple as that. We were thinking we don't want it to overpower the space. We don't want it to look too obtrusive when we're trying to have people experience and sense themselves in a medieval space. But for someone who may have visual impairments, you need them to be at least a little bit obvious. So slightly taller, there'll be QR codes as well available on that back panel there, and then we can lift them out. It's not necessarily the perfect solution. It's not a solution to every single situation, but it is a very effective, quite fun, and cost-effective solution to communal reading.
Mm-hmm. Another interesting takeaway from my research was the importance of maps to my participants, regardless of their disability. It helped them obviously get around a place, and a place like Barley Hall, which is a bunch of apartments stuck back together, it's a very confusing space to go around. I've worked at the Trust for nearly 8 years now, and I still forget that there's other spots for me to check out. But it can also help visitors plan out where they want to go to make sure that they can see everything they want to. If they have limited energy, for example, if they have a toddler who really needs a nap, they can, hit the highlights and then leave. Or if they have a sudden flare-up of symptoms during the visit, they can, make sure that they get to that one place that they really, really want to before having to leave. Other people liked having a map just to make sure that they visited everything, that completionist mindset that I super, super get, and also having more of an official route so that you could see everything that the museum wanted you to see.
Yes, so let's talk about maps. So I've included here an example. This is from the Milk exhibition that was over at the Welcome Collection, I think last year. If anyone managed to see that, they had a fantastic what I would again call an access hub with lots of bit of text. In fact, I did the thing that I'm sure anyone who works in heritage has done, which is I took a copy for myself. And I've been referring to this. And kept it. Oh yes, this is mine. And not only kept it, took it to meetings, showed it to people, said this is the kind of thing we want to be doing. If you have been going to any of the other talks today, you'll know that this isn't a new idea. In fact, we were literally at one earlier with the British Museum, with a beautiful access map there as well. So this isn't new stuff, but it is very important stuff. The image that I've included here is again art by our lovely graphic designer, Katie Smith, which shows the first draft of our map for Barley Hall. And it also shows why the map is such an important part. As Ashley was saying, it can be difficult to find your way around. You may notice that the building is in fact split in two. This is because at one point in its history, what was a corridor had the sides knocked down and became a public right-of-way. So the building actually straddles a road. In order to get to that side of it, you need to go up a set of stairs, through two different rooms, down a different set of stairs. And to get back out, you need to do it all in reverse. And that, of course, has its own issues. But a lot of guests, a lot of visitors, didn't even know that you could go down the other set of stairs. They thought you just came up and went back down, and that was the whole visit. So that's where the importance of a map for wayfinding comes in. And this particular one that we've been looking at is also marking on it access requirements to help someone plan their visit. So areas with uneven flooring, those timbers were put in green, so they are twisting and turning. It is why medieval buildings are such odd shapes nowadays, but we're getting to see it happen in real time. We also have those high thresholds marked and things like sets of stairs, low lighting, but also this is really useful from a exhibitions point of view because we've been able to include areas of the house where there are things that you are invited to touch and feel and things where we say maybe don't touch this. One of the rooms is going to have a lot of artifacts in. That's a no touching room. But our sort of motto at Barley Hall is make yourself at home. Feel like you're in a medieval house. That involves sitting on the furniture, picking up objects and being able to touch. The map gives you a great way of being able to give that information in a very accessible way without having to have someone going around or putting a little label on every single object. So big fans of the sensory maps.
Yes, absolutely. Unsurprisingly, a big theme in my research was communication, both internally and externally. Internally, the sites that were most reactive to access needs were the sites that had good internal communication, not just within the management structure, so front of house up through managers to senior leadership and boards and all of that, but also horizontally between teams like admissions teams talking to cleaning teams, talking to interpretation teams. And it's not always official communication. Sometimes it's just the person on the front desk letting a maintenance person know that the alarm in the accessible toilet isn't working as they go by. Something, very quick and easy like that.
So in the case of Barley Hall, communication with a project like this, internal communication, the basic rule of thumb, I would say, is there is literally no such thing as too much communication. In fact, I've really learned a lot from this because I should have been communicating more. How many people have had this situation where you are starting a project and you have a great big meeting with a lot of people, you outline your project, you talk about it, you talk about all the amazing new things you're going to be doing, whatever department you're in, and then you go away from that meeting. And for, in my case, 8 months after that meeting, I've been working on this 100% of the time. It's all I've been thinking about. I then have a meeting with people 8 months later. They have forgotten everything. Because for them, it's just one meeting and a long list and it happened 8 months ago. That's fine. They've got other jobs that they need to be doing. But it means that I'm now in a situation where I basically have to communicate everything all over again. And it reminded me that that communication needs to be constant, needs to be something that is worked on and is sort of unanimous throughout the organization. I attempted a solution at this. I tried to organize regular meetings with representatives from all the other teams. But there's a lot of teams. And not everyone can come to every meeting. And how many people, again, have been in, I don't know, a Zoom meeting, and one person's talking to something that only relates to one other person. And then you just kind of drift off a little and check your emails and come back and see if it's okay. That's not communication anymore. That's just having people eavesdrop. And it's not very useful. So when it comes to a situation like a project like this, where we're fundamentally changing some rather large things about how we've run museums for a long time, wall panels is just for a lot of people, it's the default. When we talk about panel content, they're imagining it on the wall. Even though 8 months ago, we had a meeting and I talked about portable panels, that doesn't matter because the default hasn't changed in their minds. So it's constantly reminding people of this change and not in a way that's just like, well, everyone should remember I invited you all to a meeting. If I were to do this again, and in fact, in future projects, I'm going to work on doing things like news blasts, sending out emails, keeping records of things, or even just making sure that the project has particular people involved from the beginning who are fully committed and are coming to everything, not having to get everybody all at once. Compartmentalizing that information in an effective way to make sure that these changes can happen and don't cause all sorts of confusion when 8 months down the line someone goes, so what are we having on the walls?
Yes. And another point about that internal communication is that different people have different communication styles. This was something that we discovered working on this.
Yes.
So I am someone who has to write things out. I'm very textual. I am very visual. I literally have written out what I want to say on a script in front of me.
Yes. And you'll notice on that script, a little line that says, Philip talks about something. Because the way that I kind of process information is very auditory. When we have a discussion about it, I'll remember the kinds of things I want to say. And I need to present like that. I actually quite struggle with written communication, which maybe that's why some of my communication didn't work as well. But that's it. For me, meetings, talking to people, that's the way I remember stuff. But now I know not everybody does. So we need to make sure that we're accessible in our communication within the organization as well.
It's not just accessibility about our visitors, it's about each other as well, which is very important. But going back to the visitors, another important aspect of communication is obviously external communication. Part of this feeds into active versus passive accessibility so that the visitor doesn't need to ask for certain information on access tools, and a staff member doesn't miss out on offering those tools as well because the visitor doesn't look disabled. On a good day, I don't look disabled either. That doesn't change the fact that I am.
So one of the ways that we tried to address communication externally is that we organized external consultation groups who came into Barley Hall with us. We showed them some of our plans. We walked around the building. We talked to them about their concerns. And what it really showed us was that even with the complete best will in the world and with all the research that we'd done, we were still getting some stuff wrong. And that's fine, because we were able to talk to people about these issues. An example that I'll give you is that one of the rooms in Barley Hall has a massive table, big wooden table right in the center of the room. Now, our first thought was that's a barrier. When you walk into the room, you walk into a table. So in my initial plans, I said, put it to one side, put it against the wall, put it in a corner. And then we've got a nice space for people to move around. As we took our access group into that room, almost all of them stepped forward and put their hand on the table, because it was a really useful, solid object to help them orient themselves in the space. People with mobility issues were finding it useful to lean against. People were using it just as a way to help find their way around. Some people just liked the texture of the table as they were moving along.
It is a very cool table.
It's a very heavy table, so I'm actually quite glad that we've decided not to move it into the corner. It's back in the center of the room. That's where it's going to be. And the flow of the room is changed. The way the exhibition is going to operate has changed because of that. So that's just one example. But this external group that we brought in were all volunteers, all happy to get involved, all from different walks of life, all with various access needs. And their feedback was incredibly valuable to us. And we are constantly trying to reassess and rework that. So I think what's important to take away from that is with that external communication, it doesn't stop.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that we've all, have that idea of, you bring in groups, you bring in different sort of community groups and children groups and all sorts of things. With accessibility, it is a bit of a weirder one because access needs can vary so much from person to person that you need to not only keep bringing in that group, but keep changing the people who are in that group as well, inviting more and different people and trying to get as much information as possible. And you'll get things wrong, but that's fine because you're putting in the effort to change it.
Which brings us on to what I think is the most significant barrier. It's something I've been calling benign ignorance. We just don't know what we don't know. And again, that's okay. Non-disabled people don't have to think about things like a disabled person does. Non-disabled people don't have to think about where the nearest seating is, how long it takes to get to the toilet, if the lighting is going to give them a migraine, if they're going to have a pain flare-up in the middle of a visit, and that's okay. What's important is that you listen to the people who do have to think about those things but more importantly, that you're not paralyzed by fear of that ignorance. A lot of pushback that I've gotten from people is that they are worried about messing up and making things worse. And trust me, not doing anything is far worse than messing up.
I've given that example of the big table already, but this sort of benign ignorance is something that can appear in all sorts of different places that you might not expect. With Barley Hall as a medieval site, there are ways that site has been run for 30 years now. There is a structure to it, there is a way that it has been done, and there is feedback. And this is very important, and I'm sure a lot of you will already know where I'm going with this, because we have external feedback. Visitors can come and they can give their responses, what they thought of this exhibition and that exhibition, what they liked about the house. But I'm sure a lot of you may have also heard of what's called feedback bias, which is the people who provide feedback usually fall into one of two groups, which are the people who really liked something and want to share their feedback, or the people who are really upset about something and want to tell you off. So you tend to get very polarizing feedback, particularly if you're doing sort of end study. There's actually a third group, though, which are the people who didn't come in the first place. Because if your site doesn't seem to be accessible, if it just looks like a medieval building with big high thresholds and low lighting, you're going to get a lot of people who decide that they're not coming. And those people aren't then providing that written feedback. And the problem with that is you don't then have quantifiable feedback you can refer to when you're trying to make the case to improve accessibility. This is where it overlaps with this benign ignorance. You might be going to someone, decision maker in your organization, saying, I think we should move towards using portable panels. I think we should do that instead, for example. And they'll say, well, why? Because we've not had any complaints about panels on the wall. We've not had any complaints about the high thresholds. We've not had any complaints about X, Y, or Z. But the thing that we need to be aware of is that those people aren't complaining because they're not coming. So when we're looking at combating benign ignorance, using things like external groups, choosing to bring people in, saying to people, who do not come to the museum, tell us why, that then gives you that quantifiable evidence you can use in order to make these changes happen. And that's very difficult to do with medieval sites because they also tend to attract a certain demographic or a couple of demographics. Particularly in York, we tend to have slightly older sightseeing people who are very interested in medieval history and younger students or young families. That's the three main demographics that come to Barley Hall. And apart from perhaps the odd pram, they often don't really talk about accessibility needs. And in particular, they don't mention that in feedback because a lot of it is just seen as, well, that's a medieval house. So we need to start looking externally and communicating externally, finding ways to bring in that feedback, to bring in those other groups in order to provide that quantifiable evidence. We can then say, look at this huge chunk of the population who don't come to our site because they think it's not for them. But heritage is for everyone. And we need to make our sites very open about that.
So to sum up, think about why you're doing what you're doing. Why do you have those panels on the walls instead of handheld ones? Why do you have certain things on your map but not others? Or why do you not have maps at all? And most importantly, why are you only including non-disabled people in your design process? Thinking about these things and really examining the reasons for your current procedures and structures can help you uncover some of that benign ignorance and even unintentional bias that's keeping barriers in place. And of course, talk to disabled people. We're not scary. We're not looking for a fight, I promise you. We just want to enjoy things the same things that non-disabled people do.
Yes, absolutely. My one takeaway, I think, for this would be, don't be afraid. Because if you are worried about messing up, you'll end up not doing anything. And that is worse. I think it's very important to come to terms with the fact now that you are going to fail at things. But that is fine, because failing is how we learn. So when it comes to accessibility, you're going to mess things up. But if you keep trying, if you keep working with groups, if you keep looking at ways to make things like medieval sites, which are notoriously difficult to make accessible, keep working at little ways that we can improve them, people will appreciate that more than just saying, I'm not going to touch it, it's a medieval site, just look at it online or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And the wise words of Miss Frizzle: take chances, make mistakes, and get messy. Yes. So, of course, come see the beast at Barley Hall. If you have any questions, my email is right here. It's afisher@yorkat.co.uk.
Mine's Roebuck at yorkat.co.uk.
And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Philip. Are there any questions? Would anybody like to ask anything while we have them here? Just raise your hands at the back.
Question.
Oh.
Hi, sorry. This is a really basic question. My name's Sophie.
Okay.
Are you going to be keeping panels on the wall and the portable panels, or are you looking to switch wholesale from one to the other?
At this stage, we're actually looking to do a wholesale switch. The reason for that is we're not opposed to putting panels back on the walls, but in order to gather that quantifiable data, we want to see how that switch works. If we move all the panels off the walls and then someone says, it was fine, but I would like panels on the walls, we can then print a new panel, stick it on the wall. But we worry that if we just have panels still on the walls and some off, then we won't be able to get the necessary feedback to see how that has operated. It also means that in a site like Barley Hall, most medieval sites, kind of the thing that you've come to see is the building. And what we were finding was that with a lot of the exhibitions, they were actually covering up the building itself. The walls looked like a book and not a lovely medieval house. So we're using what were the mounts for panels on the walls, and we're actually going to be mounting artwork, and particularly things printed on fabric, to try and, again, evoke that sense of a medieval house that is lived in, that has lovely things to look at and touch and feel, and give you that sense, but not forcing you into communal reading. But that's a really good question. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a question here.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to ask sort of roughly, I mean, you might not be able to answer this question, but like roughly how much it cost you to create these portable panels on particularly like the higher stands.
So we're quite fortunate, first of all, that we create a lot of things in-house. I work with a fantastic colleague called Patrick, who has a full workshop, and he builds a lot of the stuff himself.
Very lucky.
Yes. In terms of print cost, the difference is not massive. In the past, we've been printing mostly on material called Foamex, some of you may be familiar with. Foamex is also not recyclable at all. So this is also kind of works into our kind of green pledge as well, that we are moving to acrylic, which is 100% recyclable. And because of that recyclability, it's surprisingly cheap to print on. I believe the last quote I got, we are looking at about £15 per panel, which, considering how robust they are and 100% recyclable, is a pretty good deal.
And I'm assuming they'd also, sorry to add, but they're also kind of wipe clean, aren't they? So in terms of, because I work in a clinical setting. So
yes.
Yeah.
That was something that one of our members of the Access panel brought up. And it's as simple as making sure we have a bottle of hand sanitizer at each of the stations.
Yeah, absolutely. The only disadvantage that I can see with acrylic, as we've been looking into things, is that they're not always completely scratch resistant. You can get scratches in them. But again, for the price of them, and with having multiple panels, if one of them is taken out of action for a while and replaced with a new one, it doesn't impact the rest of the experience because the other panels are still there. Whereas if anyone here has ever seen a Foamex panel accidentally give and drop off a wall, it shatters. And then you need to buy a whole new one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another one back here.
Hi, my name is Christine. I've been to a some other talks this morning about exhibitions in historical buildings. And there was a lot of talk of using augmented reality in the exhibitions and digital displays. Do you have any experience with that? What is your advice or your view on them in terms of accessibility?
Well, from my point of view, in terms of exhibitions, I think they're fantastic. I think it's really a new way to experience heritage, and I'm actually went to a lot of those talks myself, and I'll be taking all that stuff back to my company as well and showing them different things. So I think that it is a really cool and exciting way to experience heritage. We did some workshops with students about Barley Hall, and the big theme that came out of that was that they like to see it not just dressed, but populated. So having people in, and digital work, augmented reality is a really good way to do that. It is obviously got a cost barrier to first get into, so that is something that will have to be decided in people who are higher up than me get to decide that. But I'm personally in favor of it. The only disadvantage I would say with Barley Hall when we're talking about using things like touchscreen panels and things like that is that they, again, kind of draw you out of the idea that you are immersed in a medieval world, because there are now touch points that you need to access that are very modern. It's why the portable panel stands we've tried to make fairly unobtrusive. It's not something that we are completely opposed to by any means, but having things like touchscreen panels don't quite fit our vision for what we want the experience to be like. That being said, the room with the artifacts in is not going to be dressed medievally, so that is the place where we might explore different technologies and things like that to help bring that to life. Do you have anything you want to say about the access side?
About the access point of view, I think it's really important. I saw some really, really great presentations about like fully immersive VR experiences. And from my point of view, I'm extremely nervous about people with access needs using those because you can't see the world around you. And I'm pretty stable on my feet, and even I can get a bit thrown off. And in a place like Barley Hall, which has lots of uneven surfaces, we absolutely wouldn't go any more than augmented reality. So you could still see the bits. For example, in our Great Hall, which is our biggest space, there's a medieval fireplace in the middle. It's very cool, but it's also a trip hazard. So I would not want people walking around in a fully immersive experience with a VR headset on in a room like that. But maybe an augmented reality simulation where you can watch, I don't know, someone bringing some roast pheasant from the kitchens into the Great Hall and setting it on the table at the end. Yes, that would be really cool, though.
Yeah, I think it's a case of working out what works best with your site. And we need to remember as well, though, that digital stuff is a tool to add to our toolbox.
Yep.
And it is an access tool in a lot of cases. We were talking about doing things like 3D walkthroughs of parts of the house that are very difficult to get to if you have mobility issues. Things like going up narrow staircases, you might not want to do that. You might not be able to do that. So having a way that you can explore that yourself would be a really fantastic way of accessing.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that brings that session to an end. If you've got a little green box, please leave it on your seat. Take your headphones with you for your next session. And it's just for us to say, for Ashley and Philip again, a brilliant talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.